Back to Bretton Woods is a phrase that we have often heard over the past years since the outbreak of the crisis as a way of reminding us that something needs to be fixed since 40 years, since we went off Bretton Woods, as we say. And we entered into the post-Bretton Woods non-system, as it has been labeled, and with an uneasy expression, if we take the words for their value. Now, this paper addresses an issue that has to do with what we mean when we say back to Bretton Woods. Given that the road to Bretton Woods was a long road, where there were, in fact, two alternatives that you can take a glimpse at in the picture in the background. The roads coming from the United States and the American plan elaborated by Harry Dexter White for the American Treasury, and on the other hand, the British proposal concocted by John Maynard Keynes in the name of the British Treasury. Before I get into the differences between these two proposals, I want to remind us all about one thing of the Bretton Woods system. Even yesterday, during one of the parallel sessions, I believe, some of us were there together, the Bretton Woods period was evoked as being a period of growth, of reconstruction, of growing integration, of peace and prosperity worldwide. And, well, first we should remember, as yesterday was appropriately recalled, that there was one feature of the Bretton Woods system that both White and Keynes viewed as essential to the system, which was capital controls, which makes that system, that environment, look very different from the current environment. And in fact, we should also remember that when we say capital controls, this did not imply that capital movements were prohibited outright. It simply means what the word says, controls, distinguishing between capital movements that are legitimate and helpful for the growth of the international economy, and other capital movements that may be instead a problem. The other aspect, however, that I want to draw your attention on, and I hope to be able to argue this, is that the way the monetary system, the international monetary system, was constructed at Bretton Woods not only eventually led to the demise of the system, but also to the inevitable opening up of international capital markets and to capital market liberalization. And in fact, my claim, as we argue more extensively in the paper, is that perhaps if the other course would have been taken at Bretton Woods, namely following Keynes's proposal, the capital market liberalization, which we have witnessed over the past 40 years, would not have been equally essential. Now, one reason to go back to Bretton Woods is that not just the Bretton Woods Agreement, but more specifically Keynes's plan for Bretton Woods has been recently, in the aftermath of the crisis, recalled as a possible blueprint for the reform of the international monetary system by the governor of the People's Bank of China, Zhou Zhaoxuan. So I will quote from, if I manage to show you the quote, there it is, from this paper dated 23 March 2009, where the governor says, "The outbreak of the current crisis and its spillover in the world have confronted us with a long-existing but still unanswered question. That is, what kind of international reserve currency do we need to secure global financial stability and facilitate world economic growth, which was one of the purposes for establishing the IMF." Which is, I don't know much about China, but I feel that the expression is quite ironical with respect to the role that the IMF has played over the last 70 years since its inception, because what the governor is implying here is that the IMF has not been very good at performing the task in view of which it had been designed, namely to finance temporary imbalances in the current accounts between countries. In fact, these imbalances have tended to become permanent, not by chance, but because of the very functioning of the international monetary system that the Bretton Woods agreements implied. And these, again, are appropriately singled out by the governor. The problems of having a national currency, namely the US dollar, performing the functions of an international money. Issuing countries of reserve currencies are constantly confronted with the dilemma between achieving their domestic monetary policy goals and meeting other countries' demand for reserve currencies. This is still the governor speaking, and speaking about what is known in literature as the Triffin dilemma since the early 1960s. They may, these countries, he uses the plural to evoke the fact that recently it has been the United States, but before it had been the United Kingdom, and perhaps tomorrow it might be China. They may either fail to adequately meet the demand of a growing global economy for liquidity as they try to ease inflation pressures at home, or create excess liquidity in the global markets by overly stimulating domestic demand, or we could add, referring to the immediate post-war period, the demand of the Allies, for example, and the Western world in general. The price is becoming increasingly higher, not only for the users, but also for the issuers of the reserve currencies. Here, quite ironically, he says, well, this system was designed, and as we shall see, to a certain extent imposed by the United States as the most powerful country emerging from the war, as the major creditor. And yet, after 70 years, we have to acknowledge that there are problems even for the issuer of this currency, which we might summarize. I just to show you, the main terms of the problem. What are the benefits, at least from the perspective of the issuer of an international currency? Well, the benefit is what has been recently and appropriately referred to as the exorbitant privilege of the United States, namely the possibility of not having a constraint on the external balance and being able, as we can see from this picture, to run consistently current accounts in balances that pile up into a net international investment position, which is negative and growing over the past years, and has reached by now over $4,000 billion of net indebtedness of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. The privilege consists not only in this, but as this picture also shows us, in the fact that on these international debts, they're in the face of the fact that the net international position is negative, the revenues are still positive and consistently positive, thus representing a form of international seigniorage of the United States for the fact of providing international liquidity. What are the costs? The costs are what we normally refer to in terms of global imbalances. Here you have the same net international investment position of the United States confronted with the accumulation of foreign exchange reserves, namely US dollars held as reserve assets by official bodies outside the United States. And you can see that, not surprisingly, these two variables develop along the same trend. You have, on one side, we could say, unpaid international debts, on the other side, unspent international money, which are two sides of the same problem. The debts are not paid because the money is not circulated. The money is not circulated in order for those debts to continue to be rolled over. Hence, the conclusions of Zhou Chaochuan, the desirable goal of reforming the international monetary system, therefore, is to create an international reserve currency that is disconnected from individual nations. This is the task ahead. And this is a task with which, even looking back at history, we hardly have any encouraging models or solutions, because, of course, the only reference is the gold standard, which had problems in itself. What does represent, perhaps, a model and a reference is the plan set forth by Keynes in view of the post-war world order. Back in the 1940s, Keynes had already proposed to introduce an international currency unit named Bancor, based on the value of 30 representative commodities. I have a philological problem with this interpretation of Bancor, because it doesn't seem to me that Keynes ever thought of Bancor as a basket of commodities. But still, what is interesting is the international currency unit. Unfortunately, the proposal was not accepted. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which was based on the White approach, indicates that the Keynesian approach may have been more far-sighted. So what Joe is telling us is perhaps at Bretton Woods we went in the wrong direction. There were two roads and we took the wrong road, which eventually led us to this sticky situation where there are problems for international creditors and international debtors alike. What is interesting and what struck me since I read this paper in March 2009 is the fact that the usual historical argument for not going along Keynes's road is that the plan was disappointed his American counterparts because it could not be endorsed by the major international creditor of the time, being, as we shall see, a plan which to a certain extent penalizes, or apparently penalizes the creditors. Now what is interesting is that today, or at least yesterday, I don't know how the situation is now in China, but at least in 2009, the proposal to go back to Keynes's plan came for what is today the major international creditor, which makes the picture look interesting, right? As a possibility. But before going back to this issue, I want to go at least briefly back to the history of this story in order to make clear what the concept of banker was, even with respect to Zhou Qiaoshuan's interpretation, which I think is not completely accurate. And to point this out, I have drawn this table where I try to somehow show the options in designing an international currency. Now the point that Zhou Qiaoshuan is making is that when you have an international currency, this can either be a national or an international reserve asset. And he is saying that it is preferable to have an international as opposed to a national reserve asset. Now, in fact, and this is one of the crucial points in our paper, it is not appropriate to regard Bancor as a reserve asset. Because if by asset we mean a store of value for official bodies, particularly central banks, this is not what Bancor is. Because in fact, Bancor is not a store of value. You can't, because literally you cannot keep it without spending it and without losing the purchasing power which is implied in this asset. Because, in other terms, there are what Keynes would have called, according to the general theory, artificial carrying costs. You keep that stuff, and that stuff melts like snow in the sunlight. And so there's a difference between international money in the form of what we call liquidity, which says, it's a word that says this Janus. Liquidity means the prompt convertibility of assets into money, but it also refers to the character of money as an asset, as a store of value. Bancor is not this. Bancor is a unit of account for the denomination of credits and debts for the purpose of clearing these credits and debts and making both creditors and debtors converge towards the only conceivable balance in international economic relations, which is giving as much as you are taking, eventually, in the long run. Now, the conundrum, I will not spend a lot of words on this because I'm a historian, but you're not, so you're not so much interested, I believe, in these issues, but this is a good bit of the paper. The historical conundrum is this. Why on earth, since at least at a certain stage of both of the proposals, there was this idea of introducing an international unit of account, an abstract measure for the denomination of international credits and debts, we end up eventually with a system where international money is an asset in the form of gold or the dollar in a very ambiguous relationship with one another. And we worked a lot with my colleague Massimo on this, even thanks to the fact that over the past couple of years, the proceedings of the Bretton Woods conference were eventually published. And the result, you can look it up in the paper, is sadder than we thought. Because, in fact, the interesting thing is that the conference opens on the 1st of July 1944 with a draft where the word US dollar did not appear. By 22 July 1944 comes the Bretton Woods Agreement where the US dollar is, in fact, in a crucial position. So this is the puzzle, which historically is quite relevant, because we know that not just the Bretton Woods system, but also the post-Bretton Woods non-system is a system based on the US dollar. And we usually say this was agreed at Bretton Woods. Well, it was not agreed at Bretton Woods. This was the one thing which was not discussed over 2 years of bilateral negotiations and 20 days of conference. Because the discussions, especially during the conference, concerned marginal issues, like the settlement of the quotas and other arrangements. But this crucial issue was slipped into the text of the conference almost overnight, and without the British delegation realizing what the implications of this were. I don't have time to provide evidence of this, but I do want to quote this passage from what White himself was writing in 1942. He says, if the bank, and he's referring here to the international bank, whether it's a clearing union or a stabilization fund, as he called it at the time, if it were to be established and given the authority to issue notes, or we should say in general, to issue money, even in the form of overdraft facilities, what unit should it be? It would be preferable to adopt a new unit, not to use one of the available national units, because the adoption of a new international unit of currency of account, a strange expression here, would probably meet with little opposition, whereas an attempt to use any one of the existing currencies, such as dollars, sterling, or francs for that purpose, would be opposed on the grounds that it would seem to give the country possessing that currency some slight advantage in publicity or trade. It's just an understatement of the implications. But it is a clear hint of why the United States carefully avoid discussing this issue officially during the negotiations, because they realized that they would have never managed, despite their power, to push through this proposal in face of the 44 delegations at Bretton Woods. So they keep it in the background and manage to push it through. And we eventually end up, I will spare you this, with the current, well, the former definition in the Bretton Woods Agreement of international currency as United States dollars or gold in this ambiguous relationship. Now, since my time is running out, what I shall do is to insist on the aspect which is most relevant from my perspective, namely, what's the nature of this international money proposed by Keynes is. I'm sure that most of you will be familiar with the proposal of an international clearing union. I will just remind you of the distinctive features. Keynes is proposing to establish an international bank, providing overdraft facilities. So it's a bank, but a strange bank, because you don't put money into it. There's no deposits, no reserves, no capital. You just open an account, and on that account have an overdraft facility, which is your quota as a member state, measured according to the volume of your external trade, because that's what it's supposed to finance. It's a bank for the settlement of the balance of trade, essentially, not for capital movements. With an international unit of account to denominate these imbalances, Bancor, with an irreversible convertibility of gold into Bancor. What Keynes is saying here is that, well, we used to have gold since centuries, since millennia, since Croesus and Asia Minor in the 7th century BC. There's gold performing the function of an international means of settlement. Now we're moving on to a new era, to a new money. There's no going back. There's no point in going back. And there's another practical reason why you don't want to go back. Because, unlike a gold standard, you want to have a system which constantly reminds everyone that you are out of balance, whether you are in debt or whether you are in credit. And to do so, the burden of equilibrium is symmetrically distributed between creditors and debtors. Which means, essentially, that in this strange bank, not only the debtors pay an interest on their debts, but also creditors will be paying an interest on their credits. And for good reasons. It's not just, that we want them to converge towards the equilibrium. It's because they are benefiting from the service of the clearing union. Just as the clearing union allows a debtor, a deficit country, to spend more than she can afford, the clearing union allows a surplus country to sell more than she could otherwise be able to sell. And this is even more important in a situation of permanent stagnation as the economies suffer since the late 1920s. So, and this is a completely different way of solving this structural problem of overproduction and structural deflation, as opposed to throwing liquidity on this. Because what is the difference between Bancor and the United States dollars? This ought to be evident at this point. That first, Bancor only serves the purpose of trade, and not the purpose of trading debts. Let me put it this way, since we're running out of time. Trading stuff, goods and services. And the amount of Bancor, I insist on this because even by some Keynesian authors, I was not referring to Gennaro specifically, but there's the tendency to view Bancor as an international fiat money. I think this is not appropriate because fiat money means what the word says, fiat, that there's a central banker who says how much money we are producing. The clearing union does not exogenously define the amount of outstanding Bancor. It defines the maximum amount. But the actual amount of money depends on the actual volume of trade. So it is flexible money which depends on how much trade is going on throughout the world. So it's not fiat, it's bank money, but it's not private bank money, it's official bank money. It's something difficult even to conceive, but I think it would be definitely an important starting point, not only to reform the international monetary system, but also as a source of money for regional and local monetary systems. I don't want to go into the details of those proposals that we have voiced in other contexts. I just want to conclude, since my time has run out, that the proposal of going back to the clearing union is now at the center of the attention, not just of the authors of this paper, but of other economists with which we are writing a manifesto for a European clearing union as a way to reabsorb the balance of payments imbalances within the Eurozone that are threatening to break up the Eurozone. So this is another aspect of the story in which I do not have time to go now, but if you have questions, I will be pleased to go afterwards. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, so I am the